Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabardi. Today is Monday, February 26th, so we are going to be wrapping up some of the storylines from the past weekend in sports, which includes the Bengals' decision to franchise tag their wide receiver Tee Higgins. We have some NBA storylines from the Trae Young injury news, Steve Kerr getting a contract extension and the rest of the games. And then finally, a very eventful weekend in college basketball between some court storming controversies and the idea of them potentially expanding the NCAA tournament. But before we get into all of that, just a reminder to like and follow, and for any of our live viewers to use the chat as much as possible to make this show as interactive as possible. And if you feel like sending a tip or donation, use the link streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip that is scrolling across the bottom ticker. But with all that being said, getting into our first segment here, talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, who decided to use the franchise tag on receiver Tee Higgins. This was a pretty expected move, in my opinion. I thought that they were going to do so based off of the fact that they're going to, following this upcoming season, get into the more expensive years of Joe Burrow's contract. And this seems like this is a year where, after he dealt with a lot of injuries last season, they can sort of retool, bring the group back together, and try and make another run here, as they are the only team, specifically Joe Burrow is the only quarterback in the NFL that has beaten Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs before. So just sort of running this back for one last season with this iteration for the most part, and sort of evaluating from there. Now, as it currently stands, it will be a one-year contract worth about $21.8 million. This is given the fact that whether or not the Bengals and Tee Higgins can agree on a long-term contract, they have until July 15th to do so. It made sense, I think, for them to sort of get ahead of this as soon as possible, not let him hit the open market, and see if they can work something out. Tee Higgins has been somebody who, for the past couple off seasons, his future has been talked about a decent amount because of how good of a player he is, and knowing the fact that the Bengals are going to have to cough up money to Joe Burrow and to Jamar Chase when his contract eventually runs up here. I think it's this year they're going to have to work out an extension with him, which I'm sure will be a top priority for them. So as far as the logistics of this, I think it all checks out for the Bengals here as they continue to try and be real contenders. Higgins had a down season last year. He only played in 12 games. He had just 42 catches, 656 yards, and 5 touchdowns, career lows in each of these categories. But also, of course, there was the Joe Burrow factor to all of this as well, where he came into the season dealing with a calf injury, and then as the season went on, he eventually, once he started to actually get his legs quite literally back under him, he ends up dealing with the wrist injury that takes him out for the remainder of the season. So, there were a lot of moving parts last year when it comes to the Bengals, and I think that it makes sense for them to sort of put their best foot forward, trying to get back on track here after missing the playoffs last year. And I talked about Burrow's contract here. He's entering his 5th year. They obviously picked up the 5th-year option. The cap hit is jumping from the cap hit is jumping to across the NFL. The cap is about to jump, so this is actually something that I think benefits the Bengals in the long run, upwards of $46 million. Joe Burrow's contract will be for the remainder of his contract through 2029 and 2030. So it's going to get expensive, but luckily the NFL salary cap just jumped up over $30 million as well from last season to next. It's going to be up to $255 million for the 2024-25 season. Each team will be allowed to have on their books, which means that, coughing up this $20 million for even just one season here, as they're trying to sort of give another go at this whole thing with the current iteration of what they have, won't end up really hurting them in terms of what other positions they can pay. This takes up a good amount of their cap, but it's non-committal for super long term, and it gives them a better chance to win this upcoming season. Again, I don't read too much into necessarily the down year that Tee Higgins had last year. I still think that there's plenty of potential. He's still very young, just a second round pick a couple seasons ago, and we're going to see a better version of him and the Bengals. And on that note, I think that the conversation surrounding the Bengals is interesting because of the fact that you have, in this now AFC and, the NFL as a whole, but specifically in the conference of the AFC, it is dominated by the Chiefs the past handful of years, and they are clearly the mark for the great modern team, and they're a dynasty at this point, and in order to, get to the Super Bowl, more likely than not, you're going to have to be able to knock off the champs at some point. I don't think that the Chiefs are necessarily going anywhere. They could definitely look different next year with, sort of the identity with that team. And also, for the Chiefs here, especially with this upcoming jump in the salary cap, that could be huge for them in terms of being able to re-sign their two cornerstones on defense between Chris Jones and L'Jarius Sneed. So, as much as this salary cap jump helps everybody, I do think that it particularly gives a benefit to the defending champs, trying to retain as much of their championship roster as possible. We already knew that L'Jarius Sneed he's coming into this offseason with the expectation that he's going to get paid. And I think that that is even more possible for him to get paid in Kansas City because of this jump. Now, that being said, I think that the Bengals are the biggest threat to the Chiefs in the AFC. Now, yes, of course, it's a little bit because of the fact that the Bengals are the only ones who have been able to knock off the Chiefs in the AFC, other than the Tom Brady-led Patriots that are no longer, any sort of a factor. So it's because of that, but I also do have a ton of faith in Joe Burrow, as I think he's the second best quarterback in the NFL, obviously behind Mahomes. And I do think that there's a ton of talent on that roster, and they've sort of built it up to better suit Joe Burrow and the offense of it. Now, their defense looked a lot different last season, given the departure of both of their starting safeties, Jesse Bates and Von Bell. That was clearly a different look for them, and it did hurt them to some degree. They have Dax Hill, who they drafted late in the first round a couple years ago, and it took him a little bit really to get his legs fully under him. And I still think that there's a ton of talent there. There's a reason they took him in the first round, and we've seen some of the flashes. But just the defense as a whole, sort of went through a little bit of a retooling. I wouldn't call it a rebuild. And now they're coming into this next season where obviously it's not a benefit that they weren't as good this year. It stinks to lose your starting quarterback. And again, Tee Higgins missed a handful of games as well. So the year didn't go as they imagined it coming into the season, but they get a better draft pick now as a result, and they can go into next year with the hopes and expectations that they can return back to the version of themselves when everybody was fully healthy. And I still think that all the key contributors, at least on the offensive side, are still very much there and are still factors. I don't think that we're going to see any sort of a drop off. Now, Hayden Hurst isn't there from a tight end perspective. Joe Burrow he has definitely enjoyed using his tight ends over the years, and that's maybe not quite as impactful as it was in the past, but they still were able to sort of, muster up some of that production from their tight ends. Tanner Hudson and Drew Sample, both guys that weren't really expected to be all too much. I think that when they brought in Irv Smith Jr. from the Vikings, that was more so expected to be the moves that would sort of fill in for Hurst, but instead it was these other guys that stepped up and seemed to be good enough contributors. And when you have Jamar Chase, of course, on the perimeter along with Tee Higgins, I think that you are going to be a formidable offense, absolutely. So, I think that it's very interesting when you hear a lot of these debates around Joe Burrow and the Bengals and generally who is going to be the biggest competitor for the Chiefs in the AFC. I feel like for the most part, the consensus is that it's going to be the Bengals. Now, the Bills obviously have a case as well with the talent that is Josh Allen, but I think that their roster is going to need a lot of, reconstruction this offseason. Their salary cap situation isn't great, and they're going to have some tough decisions to make that could potentially get in the way. I think the Bills are definitely still in that conversation, as are the Ravens, who are definitely in a good position as well. But another team, again, I'm very curious to see how this salary cap jump situation is going to play out across the league, because there is a lot of teams here that are in, the real competitive phase of their roster with big free agents, and I think that it's going to play a factor. It's going to allow a lot of these teams to retain the talent that they hopefully can. So when it comes to this debate, though, of who is the biggest competitor for the Chiefs, I feel like I've seen a lot of Bengals, but only if Joe Burrow is injured. And there's an asterisk that sort of sticks around, follows Joe Burrow around, as if it is sort of becoming a thing. And that's what I sort of wanted to talk about here is Joe Burrow being injured a storyline that's going to follow him through his career? Because what's interesting is during college, injuries were not a part of his story. He obviously didn't play the first couple seasons, but that was due to being in an Ohio State quarterback locker room that had tons of talent, and he just, wasn't quite the caliber. The coaches didn't trust him necessarily, as they had some first round picks in those locker rooms as well, so definitely, can't hold it against them, but he ends up transferring. The point is, he didn't miss those games because of injuries. He missed them because he wasn't seen to be good enough at the time. And then he comes to LSU, and he played 2 full seasons there where didn't really have to worry about anything then. But it really came during, of course, his rookie year when he was tackled by Trae Young and destroyed all kinds of ligaments in his knee, where I believe it is his left knee, and it was a torn ACL, a torn MCL, a torn PCL. So it was definitely a very devastating injury, and that was as a result of the Bengals offensive line was terrible when he first arrived there in Cincinnati. So he misses the majority of his rookie season. He ends up, not majority, he plays 10 games in that season. So he got to play a lot on a very bad Bengals team, but that was sort of where you tear all these different things in your knee. The last time I remember a quarterback, up and coming that specifically had that type of an injury was Teddy Bridgewater, who destroyed all kinds of things. Again, I think it was along the lines of ACL, MCL, PCL, all in that same knee that caused him to miss a ton of time, and he was just never able to fully come back into the form. It's not like he was tremendous necessarily during those early years of his career, but I do think that, if we were to replay Teddy Bridgewater's career, I don't know, 100 times. I think that the vast majority of the times we see a better version than, what is now concluded as he retired following this past season. So that was just sort of a little bit of a recent reference to what type of injury or what type of ramifications we've seen from an injury such as that. And he comes back, Burrow does, and he ends up going to a Super Bowl. So it really wasn't anything to worry about necessarily. He was able to play the majority of the next 2 seasons, but then coming into training camp this year, it is a calf injury, and it's the same calf that it's the calf on the same leg as his knee injury. So then you start to worry about, well, is this all interconnected? And ultimately, he was able to play through the first part of the season. Now, he was openly nursing it for a lot of this, and he was not the version of himself that we were used to seeing, but he at least stayed on the field. And then this wrist injury was sort of a fluke from getting hit in that Ravens game. Now, there's speculation, obviously, because there were those images that came out prior to the game of him having on some sort of wrap, but supposedly it was unrelated. It wasn't supposed to be made as big of a deal as it was, at least in the moment. So that's kind of where we're at with Burrow, and I find it interesting how many analysts say that there is this condition about Joe Burrow and openly pointing it out as if it's going to be a massive concern. Because if we're talking about the Bills or the Ravens, and to be fair, I don't think quite as many people are maybe necessarily putting the Ravens to be back, but I feel like that conversation isn't the Ravens if Lamar Jackson is healthy, or the Bills if Josh Allen is healthy. For the most part, any of these teams, if they lose their starting quarterback, then you aren't really the contender anymore and the threat to the Chiefs. But I just feel like the conversation around the Bengals is really interesting to me, because I don't think that it should be made quite such a big deal, but there is also a chance that I'm possibly being naive here and it is a bigger storyline than I guess I even acknowledge, really. So I'm sure, this upcoming season, after Burrow ideally comes back fully healthy, and we can sort of see from there, it's something that will be talked about and is going to have to be seen, I guess, that he can consistently stay healthy. But I feel like it shouldn't be quite as concerning of a story as it's been made up to this point, but only time will tell, really. So on that note, we are going to go into our first break. When we come back on the other side, we just talked about some injuries. We are going to be talking about a new injury that just took place with one of the NBA All-Stars this past year. So stick with us and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just wrapped up talking about the Bengals, the Tee Higgins extension, and the length of how much of a competitor the Bengals will be to the Chiefs in the upcoming season. Now, moving on to the NBA, talking about Trae Young, who was just ruled out for at least the next month or so with a torn ligament in his finger. He has been struggling with this injury. There were a couple videos of him really grasping at it, and it seemed to be bothering him. And, as his play on the court has played out, it's been clear that there has been some type of issue going on with him. We saw his shooting splits really struggling, and he was pretty bad offensively in their most recent game against the Raptors. So in his most recent game, I should say, they've played since then, but it has been declared from an MRI that it is a torn ligament in his finger, and he's going to need surgery on it to repair it. So at least 4 weeks, which would take us to late March, early April. The Hawks are currently sitting at 25-32 and the 10 seed in the Eastern Conference. Now, the 10 seed is obviously the last position in terms of the NBA play-in tournament. They have a 3.5 game lead over the Nets and a 4 game lead over the Raptors. And it's interesting because neither of those teams have their own first round picks. So they're bad. Both of these teams have been this year, but they are going to be pushing for a spot in the play-in tournament going forward the rest of this season because they have no incentive to bottom out. They are going to try and be as competitive as possible, and we're seeing a little bit of new versions of these teams. The Nets with a new head coach, at least an interim head coach in Kevin Ali after firing Jock Vaughn last week it was, and the Raptors, who have made a handful of trades, are going through this retooling phase where they move on from Anunoby, Siakam, and they pick up a bunch of intriguing young pieces as well. So I think the Raptors specifically are a team that could get interesting. And, the Nets have 2 potential real guys there. And I mean, more than just 2 real guys, we've talked about them in the past. Their fourth quarter offense is abysmal, but between Bridges, Cam Thomas, Nick Claxton, I've been a Day'Ron Sharpe guy off the bench, both intriguing teams. So intriguing in the fact that they could be in the picture. But again, they have been bad. So the Hawks have that going for them, but what version of the Hawks are we going to see now with Trae Young injured? Last night, the Hawks played their first game without Trae. They were able to beat the Orlando Magic 109-92. Now, I think that it's a little interesting here in terms of how impressive the win is because the Magic have been very hot, winning, I believe it was 8 of their last 10, but they were playing their third game in 4 days, second day of a back-to-back, so they were a probably physically exhausted team, and as a result, we saw them only put up 92 points in the loss, which is actually the least amount of points that the Hawks have let up all season. Now, not going to aggregate it too much, still, just a 1-game sample size, and we're going to have to see during this stretch as a whole, but that is one of the things that I think is going to be interesting is talking about Atlanta's defense, because Trae Young has never been known to be a defender. Now, I think that he's gotten, marginally better, at least over the past couple of years, specifically with the off-ball defense, but I still think that as a one-on-one defender, it can be very shaky with him sometimes, and now it's going to be DeJounte Murray, who offensively can maybe be unlocked more, see more of a version that we saw with San Antonio, and the reason why the Hawks traded 3 first-round picks in a pick swap because the market was so high on him at the time, and see if we can get a more fully unlocked version of him. He scores 25, 11, and 9 last night in a pretty impressive performance. I also love Jalen Johnson. I've been very high on him this season. I think that he's a premier most improved candidate. He had a rough first quarter, but he bounced back and showcased his abilities again. I think he's been terrific. So they've also, the Hawks, that being said, they've been dealing with injuries to their big men, which is also a pretty big part, I feel like, of Trae Young's game, is utilizing his centers, getting the pick and rolls going. And while Clint Capella has definitely had a disappointing season, I think that still his lack of ability to even stay on the court this year has definitely translated to a little bit of inferior performance from him personally, just by that standpoint. So, like I was saying, I think that this upcoming stretch is going to be very interesting for the Hawks in terms of how do they react? How is DeJounte Murray going to react with... For as good as Trae Young is, he's a very ball-dominant player that doesn't give you a lot on defense, and it definitely is enough to elevate a subpar team, which, to be fair, the Hawks have been a subpar team. But as far as this idea of team basketball, I think that that's where we've seen sort of the criticisms with Trae Young come for. And Trae Young, I mean, he's great. He's a 3-time All-Star. He's an All-NBA player in the past. So I don't mean to be negative on Trae Young. The offensive talent is absolutely there. But it's going to be interesting, I think, in terms of he's somebody that has always struck me a little bit as sort of in that Luka play style, but not quite the up-end talent of Luka in terms of the playmaking, the shot creation. And it's interesting, they're always going to be, Luka and Trae Young, always going to be connected with one another because they were traded for one another in their draft class. But it's, you know, when I make that comparison, it's just a lot of heavy usage, and his usage numbers actually aren't quite as high. I mean, they're in the upper echelon of NBA players, but it hasn't quite been, you know, top 5 or anything like that, like we've seen with Luka. But you look at the way that the Hawks offense has run this year, it's been a lot of turn taking, in my opinion, between Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. They are one of 4 teams that have multiple players in the top 25 in isolation possessions per game. The Knicks are in that group. The Mavs are in that group. The Clippers are in that group, actually with 3 players, interestingly enough. And then it's the Hawks, both Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. So it's, as far as DeJounte goes here, since coming to the Hawks, his numbers have been, obviously usage is a big part of this and being the official primary ball handler. But you look at Murray's averages when Trae is playing versus when he's not, it is definitely drastic. Some of the on-off numbers too specifically have stood out to me in the past as far as the effectiveness. I don't have those in front of me, but what I do have is the averages of just as far as games played when they both have played versus when they've not. Since when DeJounte Murray came to Atlanta, his averages are 21, 6, and 5 on 47-35 shooting splits. Without Trae Young playing in the game, Murray's averages with Atlanta are 26, 9, and 6 on 46-40 shooting splits. So, again, usage is definitely a part of this. And, you know, it's obviously you're going to get the more points, more assists, more looks, stuff like that. But Murray is somebody who was a very, heavily desired asset when he was with San Antonio, and we saw the decline of his trade value, obviously partially due to the fact of his contract, but he was not moved this past trade deadline. Now he is an expiring free agent, so they didn't like the package that was there for him, so they decided to, not move him whatsoever. But I just think it makes a very interesting conversation as to whether or not they plan to, keep him around long term, because of the fact that you gave up as much as you did, if you're the Hawks here, in order to acquire him. You can't really let him walk for nothing in free agency this upcoming offseason, which means maybe they try and work out a sign and trade worst case scenario here. I think they're going to try and bring him back. And with that being said, I'm curious what that means as far as him and Trae Young together, because at a certain point, you're going to have to make some moves to make yourself more of a legitimate contender. This was a move that they made to trade for Murray after they made the Eastern Conference Finals and they felt like they were close. And since then, they've taken multiple steps backwards to the point where they've been struggling to even be a 500 team. Now, for this stretch here, they're going to be looking to fight for their play-in positioning. They are 3-3 without Trae Young so far this season, a very small sample size, but it hasn't, at least yet, seemed to hurt them more than their season has been pretty hurt on as a whole. As far as win percentage, they are technically better without Trae Young. Now, that's skewed a little bit, obviously, because that wasn't the case until last night when they won against the Magic, making that 3-3. But I am very interested to see, specifically with the ball movement and with the defense, whether or not we can see any sort of a step forward. Now, that might not even mean necessarily an addition by subtraction situation. This might be their team coming into as a whole, and given some of these other guys getting more opportunities, they can be more confident, a little bit more refined when Trae Young comes back and potentially, win some games in the play-in tournament, try and make the playoffs and steal a series. But it just all becomes a little bit of a thought experiment here, where now we look at Trae Young and the Hawks considered him to be an untouchable at the trade deadline this year, which I think makes sense. There weren't quite as many assets available across the league, but you sort of start to take into consideration, what are they going to be doing here moving forward, where you are going to just run it back with DeJounte Murray and Trae Young. And I'm not saying you can't ever win like that, because when this deal was first made for them to trade for Murray, I thought that it was going to be a nice addition, a nice defensive asset in the backcourt alongside with Trae Young. Murray's sort of taken a step back himself in terms of individual defense since he was traded for, and the 1-2 punch that we were expecting hasn't really played out quite as strongly as we were expecting it to. So the Hawks, they're a very peculiar case, I feel like, because you go back, there are all these stats about the mediocrity of this team. I think before a couple games this past weekend, yesterday might have offset it, but there was a stat that was out there about how the Hawks were 750 and 750 in their last 1,500 games, and that's been a thing that's surrounded them for a while. You go back, and there's plenty of stats that have been out there. Again, I'm not sure how much they still hold up, but a lot of quotes about them just being the pinnacle 500 win percentage team, and they are hoping to overcome that, and they've been just stuck in this place of mediocrity, which is always the worst place to be in the NBA specifically. So I'm not sure exactly what the move is. Now, again, I think that Jalen Johnson is developing into a very nice piece for them, and I understand why they considered him untradeable at the trade deadline, but there are going to be teams in the upcoming offseason that are probably going to make some calls about Trae Young. The Lakers have already been rumored to be one of those teams, sort of as a fun thought experiment. A lot of people have potentially linked Trae Young to the Spurs to pair him up with Victor Wembanyama, as the Spurs desperately need a floor general from there. And I think that him and Wemby would be an incredible lob combination, and just the offense of them being able to play off of one another would be very interesting to see. So I guess we will, again, just have to wait and see how this all plays out. I do not think that he has yet played his last game in Atlanta, but we could definitely see a winding clock here. I know we have a Hawks fan or two here, or a Hawks fan or two here at the GSMC Sports Network, so I will probably have to bring one of them on at some point to discuss this further. But as for now, that is all we have on the subject. We're going to be taking our second break, and when we come back, we are going to be talking about some of the biggest storylines from the NBA this past weekend. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Getting into our next subject here, talking about the NBA headlines from this past weekend. Before we get into the games themselves, we had some news other than the Trae Young injury about Steve Kerr, who got a contract extension, making him the highest paid head coach in the NBA in terms of annual value. He got a 2-year, $35 million extension that is good for $17.5 million per year, which surpasses Spoelstra. Greg Popovich does technically have a higher contract annually, but he is also the president of the Spurs, so holds more of a job description than just a head coach alone. As far as pure head coaches, Steve Kerr takes the reins in terms of the highest paid annually. My reactions to this is it makes a lot of sense. Now, Kerr has not been without scrutiny, while the Warriors have sort of staggered a little bit over these past couple years, but ultimately, I don't think that there is anything differently he really could have done. Now, the integration of the young pieces into the starting lineup and as real contributors hasn't been necessarily perfect. We've seen sort of the lack of development in these crucial, draft slots where they've had a lot of good draft capital over the past couple years, and it hasn't necessarily panned out to be immediate success. This goes back to the James Wiseman draft in 2020, where he never fit in with the Warriors there. And I thought that it could have, because the big thing with Wiseman in that case, at the time at least, was the defensive awareness and sort of, I felt like, some of the more coachable aspects of the defensive side of the floor. And I thought that playing alongside Draymond Green was going to be able to, and Draymond specifically I reference because of how much of a vocal leader he is, how he's been the catalyst for their defense and has really held other players accountable, sometimes in a more beneficial way than others. But we saw Andrew Wiggins, of course, take the leap that he did specifically for their finals run in 2022, and I thought that we could see this organization help elevate James Wiseman to play some version of the brand of basketball that they were needing from him to be competitive. Ultimately, they end up winning a finals without him and trade him for a bunch of second round picks, for them to be exact, and in turn use those to get Gary Payton Jr. So he never panned out there. Of course, We've seen a couple of their other lottery picks. Kuminga has been a long time coming, but he is finally developing into the version of himself that made him be so highly touted coming out of high school, coming into the NBA draft, and being selected with the 6th pick. Moses Moody is someone that, again, lottery pick, wasn't necessarily seen to be superstar potential, but I thought that, and I still do think that there is some ceiling there that just hasn't been scratched. He's been dealing with a lot of inconsistencies in his playing time and in his shooting percentages as well. So, I think that is where, if you're going to give Kerr criticism, that's where it comes from. But, winning the 2022 finals the way that they did, especially after beating a Celtics team who maybe weren't the war-tested team. It's always interesting when you look at sort of the playoff failures, because it's this idea that in the NBA you need to suffer a playoff failure before becoming a championship team. Maybe that was for the Celtics, maybe that wasn't. They had made a bunch of Eastern Conference finals, but all in all, I think that Celtics team was better roster-wise than what the Warriors had, but the experience from the coaching, from the players themselves, they won that one. And the past couple years haven't been great for them, but they've still been hanging around there, and I don't think it's just quite as simple as Steph Curry alone. And now we've seen them be able to incorporate some more of the younger guys this season, at least, between Brandon Podziemski, Trayce Jackson-Davis, who has been great for them as of late. And I don't know, I guess Kerr, you can sort of pin it on him a little bit, the way that Draymond has been. Draymond's always going to be Draymond. It's pretty much impossible to hold that against him, but to let it spiral out of control the way that it did, I feel like after some of these, real canon events for the Warriors, with Draymond arguing with KD that really caused the rift and the departure of Kevin Durant for their team, or him punching Jordan Poole, it just doesn't feel like there's been necessarily tons of accountability from Kerr in these instances. But again, I'm not sure how much he possibly really could have done as it is anyways. But he gets this extension. It officially lines him up long-term to have his contract expire as Steph Curry's does through 2026. So it ties them together, at least through these next contracts, and I would imagine Kerr is going to, assuming that he wants to stick around long term, as with Steph Curry, I don't see Curry playing for another organization. I know that people sort of like to throw out the ideas of it potentially, but I don't see that happening. I don't see Kerr going anywhere either, so it's going to have to be a little bit of a, we'll see how these next couple years all play out. The Warriors have been playing better as of late, but you look at a game like last night where they play the Nuggets, and I just don't think that they are on the same level as that Denver team, which is a real contender. And their offense has been very nice for a lot of these games, but I just don't think that they're in a position right now, especially with the volatility of Klay, that I won't get into all too much. We've been talking a lot of Klay Thompson on the show lately, and I just think that this core is past its level of contention. Now, does that mean that I think the Warriors as a whole are, you can write them off for the next handful of years? I don't think so, because I still think that Steph Curry is an incredible player. I think he can still be the best player on a championship team. I just think that you need to sort of figure out some of the others in this situation. If you can upgrade at a forward position, I know that they're not going to want to trade Kuminga at this point, and I don't know. I don't think that they will, especially because, frankly, I don't know what other options there really are out there. But they're going to need to make upgrades at certain positions as a whole. Whatever this next star that's available is, I think becomes a very interesting conversation when you talk about the Warriors, who, of course, did check in on LeBron James earlier, but around the trade deadline. It's on their minds that they potentially are looking for that next move, and they're not afraid to make a splash. So we'll see with all of that. There have been rumors that have come up over the past couple years about trying to go and acquire Giannis. Now, Giannis probably is staying in Milwaukee. I know that he just re-signed on an extension last year, but we've sort of just seen the diminishment of free agency really with some of these stars in the NBA. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he could potentially get unhappy if things go the wrong way here in Milwaukee. And he talks so much about the idea of wanting to play for an organization that's all in, and that is Golden State sort of to a T, the way that they've been, for the past decade plus now. Just decade plus is a little stretching it a little bit, but I mean, they've been as committed to winning as anybody else in the league has, and it would be quite the sight there with Giannis in Golden State. But moving on here to sort of some of the other big storylines from the weekend. On the note of Giannis, the Bucks did pick up a couple big games versus some potential contenders. It started Friday night where they played the Minnesota Timberwolves on the road and end up coming out on top in that one. I thought that what was specifically big for them was being able to come out in the second half of a close game and win that one. I think that their second halves, we've seen a lot of collapses from them and coming out flat, having other teams sort of adjust to what they're trying to do and beat them that way. But it was them dominating that third quarter where they win 36-13, and they were able to sort of power their way past the Timberwolves and stave them off for the rest of the game. You get big contributions for Malik Beasley in that third quarter there, and you end up pulling that one out by playing some pretty solid defense as well, which is something that has of course been a massive conversation around the Bucks for the entirety of this season really, and I think that that was probably just about their best win this season as a whole. They also stomped out the 76ers yesterday afternoon, which I included them in the potential contenders phrasing there. I still am not bought in on the 76ers. I feel like I should maybe take them out of it because at this point I would be surprised if the Sixers were to win the finals, and obviously if they were to, this would be with Joel Embiid. They wouldn't be able to do so without. But again, another really good job defensively in that one, held Philadelphia to just 98 points. So I thought that that was a very nice way for them to come out in the second half of the season here, coming out of All-Star break and being able to sort of establish yourselves, as I know that things looked really bad there at the end of the first half of the season with that loss to Memphis, but we are to be taken seriously, and I think that that's what they showed through these first couple games. They have one of the most difficult schedules going forward for the rest of the season, so they're going to be battle tested, but I think that that is honestly a plus for them because you might drop some extra games, but as we keep saying on this show, I think that it's so much more than just wins and losses for the Bucks. Otherwise, they wouldn't have fired Adrian Griffin. It was about changing the identity, making yourself look like more of a legitimate championship team, and they're going to have plenty of opportunities against some of these other top teams in their conference and some in the Western Conference to sort of get those real reps against the top competitors and grow from there. So Bucks, not saying they're officially back, but they are in the direction of sort of ideally getting to play some of their best basketball down the stretch of the season. And if that happens, I think that anything can go down in that Eastern Conference. That is pretty open. The other main takeaway I had from this weekend that I'm just going to quickly cover because I feel like I talk about him a lot here on this show, but that is Victor Wembanyama, who put together 2 straight 5-block, 5-steal games. And we're still, not necessarily seeing the closing, perfect offense from him down the stretch. But I wanted to just at least mention the idea of him winning Defensive Player of the Year. Now, I know that it is out of reach. Rudy Gobert has been the leader in this category for the majority of the season in terms of odd-wise, and he plays on one of the best defenses in the league. He is the best defender on that team who really controls it all. He's probably going to run away with it, but Wemby's going to make an all-defensive team. I would imagine this upcoming season. I don't remember off the top of my head. I know that the All-NBA teams are going to positionless. I'm not sure if that is included in, all defensive teams, because he's a top 2 defender in the league this year. So will he be first team? If it's still positionally based, he'll probably be second team, also listed as a center. But he just continues to impress me so much, and we talked about the face of the league next year. Or last week we talked about sort of the next face of the league conversation, and I do think that he has real potential in that as well, because of just the freakish size and dimensions of him, put along with the fact that he seems like a very a very smart, well put together young piece that could be a potential role model. And I just think that this is the worst we're going to see him at offensively, at least like the least polished, and he's going to continue to get better. And I think that he is a very impressive young prospect. So that is all we have time for right now in terms of the NBA, but sure, we will be getting into plenty more as the week comes on. We're going to be taking our final break, and when we come back on the other side, we're going to be talking some college basketball after a lot of controversy going down this weekend in the NCAA. So stick with us. We will be getting into all of that right after this break. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. For our final segment here, we're going to be talking some college basketball. We're getting closer and closer to March Madness, which I am very excited for, just about my favorite time of the year, and a very interesting weekend in college basketball these past few days, where and a lot of controversial stuff. It started off early in the week where the president, I believe he is, of the NCAA was talking about, Charlie Baker, that is, was talking about the idea of potentially adding more teams to March Madness, and that caused a lot of debate. My quick thoughts on it: I would be very much against it. I think that I understand the money-making perspective, and at the end of the day, I like watching sports, so I would tune into these games, but it's already 68 teams with the last four in, or first four in, whatever it's called, but I just think there's no need, and you should have to actually accomplish something in order to make it to the tournament. At the end of the day, I think that, yeah, when you have some of these bigger brands possibly not make it, it can be a little bit disappointing, but at the same time, I think that you shouldn't just be, gift wrapped an invitation to an event that is not about making money, but is about winning a national championship. And when we talked about this with college football, I think that it makes sense. You lose a little bit of the lore to the regular season and the importance of every game in, game out in college football. But 4 is a very small pool, and that was, of course, expanded from the pre-college football era, where for the longest time it was just the top 2 teams played for the national championship. And I can at least get behind the expansion more so there, especially with the other almost politics of it, where you had so many teams and players not showing up for the bowl games, and it just resulted in a little bit of a gross, messy product during bowl season. I think this will sort of re-energize that season a little bit more. And again, 12 teams. What does the 12th ranked team in college football necessarily fully do to earn their place in the college football playoffs? I don't know, but we have over 2/3 of the NBA getting into at least the play-in tournament. So ultimately, I don't think it's a disaster. In those in the college football instance, in this one with college basketball, I think quite literally, if it's not broke, don't fix it. I have no idea why they would do this other than making money. And Baker tried to make the argument about access and all of that. There's more than enough access. You get an automatic bid if you win your conference. Plus, you can get an at-large bid if you are a legitimate team. And no, that's not saying that every team that is, decently good and all of that makes it every year, but that's why it's a playoffs. It's supposed to be exclusive, and it's not supposed to be a participation thing. It's supposed to be about putting the teams who did what they needed to during the regular season to deserve a chance to win the national championship. And that's just my 2 cents on that. Probably went a little longer than I was even hoping to, but the other big storyline that came out from the actual games itself was the court storming chaos that took place between Duke and Wake Forest, where after Wake Forest upset Duke at home, the fans stormed the court, and Duke star center Kyle Filipowski was injured, and he had to be helped off the court. It appears to be a knee injury. Status is still a little bit unknown here. It took away a lot, in my opinion, I think, from what was a very good team, or a very good win for a Wake Forest team that is also one of those good teams that I was sort of referencing, is along that bubble, is a good team, but you have to do something to prove that you are worthy of going to the tournament. This was a great start for them with this win against Duke. As far as this incident itself, though, Kyle Filipowski said that he thought it was intentional. It's really hard to say. It was just a tricky situation as a whole. There are a lot of people on the internet right now blaming Filipowski for the contact. He did definitely initiate it some, where he sort of almost looked like, when you look at the overhead angle, he shoved out and stuck his leg out a little bit that he ended up getting injured on. But I don't blame him for these circumstances as a whole. I think that, the entire system of this is flawed. the fact that Wake Forest fans not just stormed the court, but did so before the final buzzer even officially went off. I think that this is something. I went to Quinnipiac University, where the basketball team is, not pulling off these big upsets, don't have these big rivals in basketball where there's an opportunity to storm the court. So this is something that, as somebody who's never been in any sort of a similar situation, I can't relate to. And I think that it's hard for me to, pound my fist on the desk and say that storming the court needs to be banned, because to a little bit of a degree, it's tradition, and it is very cool when it isn't done in a harming way. But we've now seen 2 star players between Filipowski and Caitlin Clark just a month ago end up injured from court stormings. And when it starts to get in the way of the actual product on the court, I think that is when we have to at least acknowledge that things need to change. Running onto the court before the game even ends is absurd. Even if it was just a few tenths of a second, that is, not good for the product itself. And there needs to be some sort of way to protect the athletes themselves from suffering injuries, because this is quite literally their jobs, is to go out and play basketball. And that's why I hate so much the argument that a lot of people have made of, well, next time, don't lose. It's the same logic of, how do you avoid getting in a car crash? You never get in a car. But this is their actual jobs. A lot of them get paid for this, if not now, are hoping to get paid at the next level for additional money. And why even play in college sports if, you get punished, you get physically punished for losing? And obviously it gets aggregated a little bit here because we're talking about Duke and the brand behind that, and the instances that it is harmful are so far and few between. But there needs to be some sort of protocol in place where it doesn't get to this point, because it shouldn't take a bunch of players getting injured to have to make moves. It should be something that we just acknowledge. There shouldn't be a risk of injury in case you lose. That doesn't add up to me whatsoever. And after the game, both head coaches in John Shire of Duke and Steve Forbes of Wake Forest spoke after talking about the dangers of fans storming. Shire was very adamant that he wants court storming to be banned. And, it's definitely an interesting topic too, especially when you look at Duke specifically. Nobody's going to have empathy really for them or pity them, but it is interesting the fact that, Duke fans are never really going to be able to benefit from something like storming the court, because they are the ones that have the target on their backs the majority of the time. And that comes with being good, and I'm sure they wouldn't have it any other way necessarily, but there are just such few instances where they would actually be the ones that are storming the court, upsetting a team at home because of the product that they are. And again, I'm not trying to cry Duke any sort of a pity party or anything, because they're good. That's what happens. We see it in every single sport. When you are good, there is an extra motivation and sort of, you look at the Chiefs and the way that they were hated. There's an aspect of villainy that comes with just being good. You're the evil empire. And, I'm not also trying to build up Duke to too high of levels, but it's just the reality of the brand of what they are. If they lose on the road, especially to an unranked team, they are going to sort of get danced on. And that's fine to some degree, but again, specifically just referring to keeping the athletes safe, something needs to change. Now, in my opinion, I don't think that there is a real way to prevent storming the court. And I don't think that there necessarily has to be in general, but some way to just hold them back long enough to give players the chance to walk off the court. And I think that it's crazy. The Caitlin Clark instance, too. People are like blaming her for the collision. That shouldn't be an argument. They should be allowed to get off the court so then you can celebrate. Even if it's 30 seconds that you put on the Jumbotron and you allow the other team to quickly get off the court, and then you can have the home team sort of build up the anticipation, start to welcome their fans onto the court, and I don't know how you even necessarily enforce that. There needs to be more security, especially if you're playing in a game like this, Duke versus Wake Forest. Like I said, Wake Forest is a good team, and I feel bad for them that this is sort of what the takeaways have been from this game, but just stock up on a little bit of extra security for this one game alone in case you win, which you would think as Wake Forest, you think there's a chance you can win. And I don't know. I think that I don't have all the answers to this, and I don't think that anybody necessarily does, but we should all agree that something needs to change about all of this. Last few thoughts here before we wrap up the show. The new AP polls just dropped this afternoon, and following UConn's big loss on the road against Creighton last week, they fall out of the number 1 ranking for the first time in 6 weeks. They go down to number 3, which in my opinion is a little extreme. Definitely okay with them not being number 1, but they fall behind Purdue, which I don't fully understand. They lost to Creighton, who, of course, fueled somewhat by their big win against UConn, enter this week as number 12. They were number 15 when they played last week. And for UConn here, was coming off of a massive win, beating down on Marquette last weekend. On the road now, sort of a little bit of a letdown spot. Now, should have been prepared for it because Creighton is a very good team, so there's no excuses in that sense. But I just feel like to fall 2 spots because of one loss, a quad 1 loss against a very good Creighton team, is a little strange to me. But Houston ends up taking their spot at number 1. First time they've had the number 1 ranking since the 1982-83 season. They notably had an overtime thriller versus Baylor on Saturday. They were able to put it on Baylor in that first half, just stifling them with their defense, which maybe to a casual basketball watcher isn't necessarily, too must-see TV, but I just find their defense and the way their play style so intriguing, so physical, and it's like fun. It's kind of refreshing, especially if you're one of those people that complain about there's no defense in the NBA, any of that. Watch a Houston Cougars game, and I think that you will be entertained. But after stifling Baylor for that first half, Baylor came out on a 12-0 run to open the second half, climbed their way back from a 17-point deficit, and they never held a lead in regulation, but they had a chance to win it off of a Yves Missi free throw at the end of regulation, but he couldn't knock it down. Game at that point, it was a tie game. Right after that, Jamal Shed knocks down a heave of a three-pointer, but it was just after the buzzer, so that game does go to overtime, in which Houston just sort of controls it and ends up putting away Baylor. As a result, they get the win and the number 1 ranking in this week's AP poll. I thought that on the note of, Jamal Shed, incredible. We've talked about him before. He really led the charge. On the Baylor side of this, where Missi really struggled in this game, and I do like him as a prospect, but he had a rough one. But how about Jacoby Walter, who we've named as potentially going to be the top college guy off of the boards in the upcoming 2024 NBA draft? He drops 23 points, specifically on 5 of 10 from 3, which has been a little bit of a concern with him, is the consistency of his jump shooting. That 23 points was the most that any player has scored against Houston this season. So a very good sign for the potential lottery pick, and something that he can hopefully build off of, because I think we are sort of sitting around, I'm not, at least speaking for myself, waiting around for one of these star freshmen to really jump out and make some noise here, become a star in March Madness. I think Jacoby Walter has that potential on a very good Baylor team. I know that I'm talking a lot of Baylor right now after Houston's the one that wins it, but I like Baylor a lot. I think they have a lot of good players. I think they could be a sneaky, I don't even know if you'd consider them a dark horse, but a real threat when March comes around, which we are just on the corner of. So we will continue to be talking about college basketball as it comes on, but that is all we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you to the network for allowing us to host this show. We will be back tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Just a reminder to like and follow wherever you may be catching us, and we will see you tomorrow. Thanks for joining us today.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet.